Well, hey, good morning, y'all. Thank you for taking some time to be at this roundtable. I've been to other roundtables, and I feel really lucky that so many of y'all are able to make it because I know they're not always at convenient times. So really thank you. My name is Cody. I use pronouns. I'm the program director for UCCSlead and Chancellor's leadership class. And thank you. And with UCCSlead, what we are is we're a free student leadership development program on campus, open to all UCCS students. And this is actually pretty unique. At most campuses, they have a program like ours, but you have to pay for it, oftentimes apply for it at the same time. You might even have to be nominated for it by a staff member or faculty member. For us, it's super convenient. You just sign up for our programs and you show up. So we're kind of like fast food, really convenient, but better quality. So with that, our mission is to develop ethical, world-changing leaders. And we do that through a few programs. So first, we have our Game Changer, and this is our flagship program. Really what we're trying to do is disrupt the way our students think about leadership and really talk to them about their personal leadership style, how they can put that into practice. And when they do this, they receive a certificate that they can put on a resume and a graduation cord that they can wear when they walk the stage. So they get quite a bit from doing this experience. We also have our Days of Service. So the purpose behind Days of Service is just to connect students with nonprofits in the area to do volunteer work. And hopefully they find a nonprofit that aligns with their interests, maybe their values, their career, and they continue to do this volunteer work into the future. That doesn't always happen, but that's really the goal. And then finally, we have our micro workshops. And that's really what I've been working with this. Brenna and I and Sloan before, we are building out a menu of different micro workshops that we can come and bring to you in your classrooms for your students. And with that, I've been working on one as part of my DFEI deliverable. And one thing that I've been really thinking a lot about is bad leadership, because all of our students in some way or form are already engaging in leadership practices right now. And they're doing it on campus, they're doing it off campus. So I'm trying to develop a workshop specifically for our student leaders in clubs and orgs. There's not something that exists currently for that. There have been iterations of this in the past, but I think one thing that we've underutilized in the extracurricular world of leadership studies is bad leadership. Because it's not that it's not there, we just don't really go in depth in the way that we really could. There's a lot of potential for this. So I'm going to show you two statistics, and I have no illusion that you probably know what these refer to. But these are really important statistics. So 32% of 25-year-olds have had leadership development training. That's it, 32%. And then of those 32%, only 50% of that leadership training was actually impactful, meaning it yielded long-term impact. That's pretty stunning. 16% of all leadership development, or 16% of these 25-year-olds have had impactful leadership development. That's not much. There's a lot we can do with this. There's a lot of potential, and that comes from the Center for Expanding Leadership and Opportunity. John Duggan is one of the leading scholars in leadership studies, and he is the co-founder of that institution. These are stats that they've been working to cultivate over the years with all their data. But we know that now more than ever, there is a lot of opportunity and a need for effective leadership development. So here is just a chart from Gallup, and it tracks Americans' confidence in 15 different institutions. So you can see over here we have 2021, then 2022, and 2023, which is the last year that they have this data available for us. Just focusing over here, what do you notice? Decrease in confidence. Among how many of them? Or maybe not even decrease, so decrease in confidence, but what else even beyond that? Not just decreasing. But what do you notice about the trend lines? And maybe I'm using the wrong term, but essentially, there are only 2 here that are actually positive. Small business and the military are the only ones that, as of 2023, still maintain a majority of confidence among Americans, or confidence among a majority of Americans, I should say. Everyone else is below 50%, and most of them are quite a ways below 50%. The Supreme Court's at 27%, banks at 26%, public schools, I mean, we've seen that a lot in the news, 26%, and then it gets worse. Congress, no one believes it. 8%, right? There is an extreme lack of faith in American institutions. And we know that leadership education, when it's effective, is a piece of the solution to shoring that faith back up. Because a lot of this is Barbara Kellerman, she's a Harvard professor, and she's really kind of the leading voice on bad leadership. She talks about how Americans today honestly feel like bad leadership's inescapable. They don't think you can get away from it, which is why trust is so low. We just don't believe in our leaders because they so often seem to fail us or not prioritize our needs. So again, if we can prepare our students to lead effectively, we can address this and help build it up. So, yes, so with bad leadership, let's talk about the status of bad leadership studies. So Barbara Kellerman, in 2004, she writes a book called Bad Leadership. What it is, when it happens, why it matters. And the first thing she does is she takes to task this idea that leadership is inherently good. I mean, right from the get-go, she cites a preeminent scholar who published a really influential book in the 1980s. His name is Warren Bennis, on becoming a leader. And he has this assumption that to be a leader is to be a good leader. And she immediately takes that to task. So no, that's not the case. Not inherently the case, right? Being a leader is not necessarily good. And we talk about this in UCCSlead, and some of y'all who may teach leadership probably talk about this in your courses, right? Leadership is not inherently good. It's not inherently ethical. And so she immediately takes that assumption to task. And the way she does that is she wrote a manifesto. Well, it's called Hitler's Ghost, the Manifesto, in 2000. And she argues that the best example of why this is not true is Adolf Hitler. He haunts leadership studies because since the 1970s, when this kind of became more of an academic discipline, we've been operating under this assumption, kind of in denial. We know Stalin, Putin, these leaders exist. We don't like to talk about the bad because we like to focus on how to do good. But with Adolf Hitler, there's no question he was an effective leader. Was he an ethical one? Absolutely not, right? He did horrible things, but his ghost haunts the whole study of leadership. So with that, this was 2 decades ago when she wrote this. This is now commonplace. Like I said, many people in here who teach leadership probably use Adolf Hitler as a really good example of how effective leadership is not the same thing as ethical leadership, right? So 2 decades have passed. We see bad leadership take more root in the classroom. We see it take more root in both in extracurricular arena as well. But the problem with it is we're not, I would argue, at least on the extracurricular side, and I'd be curious to hear from some of the faculty who do teach this, how in-depth are you going when you get bad leadership examples? Because I would argue, at least on the extracurricular side, it often boils down to platitudes. So for example, it would be like, well, you should not tolerate bullying because that creates a hostile workplace and bad culture. But oftentimes we leave it at that because it sounds so obvious. Why should I have to explain this? Of course, It makes a hostile workplace. Of course you lose trust. Of course people want to leave. You have higher turnover. Okay, but how much more deeper learning could we do if we actually took that and we talked about examples? And more importantly, not examples of the bullying, because we probably can recognize the bullying fairly quickly. How do we handle the bullying, right? If it's workplace harassment, how do we actually, like, what steps are we taking in using those examples of maybe how certain leaders maybe didn't do enough and where they can go further, right? That's where the deeper learning comes in, but oftentimes bad leadership gets boiled down to things that are just passing references where we say, you know, obviously don't do this because this is what you should be doing. The focus is on the good and implicitly saying the opposite is bad. So again, there's more work that we can do here. And the reality of it is bad leadership is a really fun pedagogical tool because we're all interested in bad and what it means to be evil. So when I was in kindergarten, I was asked, like probably everyone here, to draw out my dream career. Who did I want to be when I grew up? At the time, I watched Batman, I watched Power Rangers, I watched Spider-Man, and so everything that I wanted to be was rooted in all that, but it wasn't actually rooted in the heroes. It was rooted in the villains. I'm sure most of y'all probably have had the exact same reaction. Batman's cool and all, Bruce Wayne, sure, but Joker, Clayface, Mr. Freeze, that's where the interest is, right? Spider-Man, we can talk about Venom, we can talk about Carnage, we can talk about the Green Goblin, the Hobgoblin. Why would we spend so much time on Spider-Man when all these other people are so much more interesting, right? So then what did I do? I'm given this task. So what I decided to do was I drew a robber. That's what I wanted to be. Someone who robbed. And I cannot find that. I'm sure my parents, because they actually, bless their hearts, they put it on our refrigerator. So good parents, they put my drawing on the refrigerator. It was great, and I couldn't find it, but I did search the internet and I found something that looks uncannily similar to what I drew. Just take out the cape, take out the hat, the tie. And that's basically what I put, just put a bag of money in this. And that's what I wanted to be, right? We're drawn to the dark side. We are, psychologically. It's interesting. Why do you think people are really invested in true crime and horror? So talk to me. Cult of the Killer, what is this? When I'm saying this, what would you guess this is about? Son, yeah, go ahead.
Yes, based on like true crime and stuff, interest in like the other or the evil in that case.
Right, the other, the evil. Yes, and this kind of different perspective, lived experience that takes things to the excess. Right. What else?
I guess there's like a question there of like, for those people who are iconic or being bad, is it that they had innate charisma to be able to achieve those terrible things? Or is it that people are drawn to like the evidence of power? Or yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's something I didn't think about. But yes, absolutely. Yeah. How did they get away with the things that they got away with, especially in true crime with Ted Bundy and things like that, and Manson, right? With the Cult of the Killer, one of the best movies that I've seen recently that's really tackled this. This is actually the original Michael Myers, but it's David Gordon Green's Halloween from 2018. So what he did that was really interesting is he put the focal point not on the killer, but on the survivor, on Jamie Lee Curtis's character, Laurie Strode. And what he did was question why we're so fascinated with the killer when we really need to focus on the trauma that the survivors and the victims endure. And there's a scene where the psychologist is still trying to figure out what makes Michael Myers tick. And Michael Myers brutally bashes his head in to show you're missing the point. That's not where our focus should be. And yet we spend a lot of time really cheering on the killers in horror movies. That's something that academics have written about, how you go to a horror movie and oftentimes, especially if it's a slasher, people will cheer as people are being dismembered, right? Because you actually care more about the killer than you do the victims. And part of that's because the writing's not great. And they didn't really build good characters to begin with. But you also see this with true crime. There was a lot of controversy when Dahmer came out, right? And Evan Peters was getting a lot of people saying, ooh, he looks fantastic in this. And like, but he's also playing a serial killer who did a lot of horrible things to dozens of men. And a lot of people just didn't care, right? It's the fan mail to serial killers, right? We have a whole cult of the killer and around killers because we're fascinated by evil. And there are whole academic studies that really dig into this. So one of them is Vader, Baltimore, and Other Villains. Came out in 2011. And the second chapter in it is by Daniel Forbes called The Aesthetic of Evil. And he talks about how, honestly, villains are cool. Darth Vader is cool. Lord Voldemort, cool. Like Darth Vader, are you kidding me? He's wearing a whole suit of armor and he's got a really cool lightsaber that's red. I mean, sure, Luke Skywalker's is green, but like his is red, y'all. You know, Darth Maul, all the cool makeup, the horns, and it's two sides of red lightsaber. That's cool, right? He talks about that. He calls it the aesthetic of evil. He says there's multiple reasons why we're interested in evil and bad. So the first is kind of as we talked about, why? How did they get away with this? Why would they do this in the first place? Evil begs an explanation. You have to figure out why they did it. The second part is sometimes we actually feel sympathy for the villain, and that can cause some internal conflict. Because what it really shows is that the distinction between good and evil is not always clear cut. And so sometimes we have to think about that a little deeper. At the same time, that distinction between good and evil may also be just a difference in perspective. We alluded to this earlier. I think about Godzilla, King of Monsters, and how the group, the terrorist group, is fighting for basically to save the world in their eyes from climate change and destruction. So some people may identify with that ideologically, right? And so sometimes we're looking at it and we're saying, well, this killer and this hero are using the same mechanisms for totally different goals. They're both being deceptive, they're being manipulative, and they're using violence, but to different means. So maybe they're not all that different to begin with. Again, it's things that we have to consider, especially as we move into leadership. And then, of course, on a very basic level, we know that evil shows us what we should not do, right? But that's all framed within an ideological perspective. So we have to consider that. So with that, one thing that I like to do is I like to think about, like, yes, it shows us what we should not do if we have the right tools to understand that, right? We can't just know implicitly this is what not to do. We need to have a framework to make sense of that. So Barbara Kellerman, in that bad leadership book, she actually makes, she prescribes 7 paradigms of bad leadership. So this is one framework we can use. And the next one is the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative. And I think, not initiative, but the principles, right? And I think what's nice about this pairing is that the 7 paradigms of bad leadership provide large categories where we can group bad leadership, broadly speaking. But then the Daniels Fund Ethics Principles really digs into the what is going on. What specifically are they doing? And what are the things that the principles that they're violating? It is an ideological perspective, right? There's other ethical value systems that we could apply to scenarios. It doesn't have to be just the Daniels Fund ethical principles, but those are really helpful to get students to think about, why is this bad? What, because this, again, broad categories, what specifically is going on? So with these 7 paradigms, what's going to happen? Oh, and I wanted to show you, these are the ethical principles. So we have integrity, trust, accountability, transparency, fairness, respect, rule of law, and viability. So what I want to do is I want to take some time, and we're going to actually play this out with a scenario that many of y'all probably already have seen. So how many of y'all watched Avengers Infinity War? Right. Almost everybody. Right. So y'all are probably familiar with Thanos' The Snap. So what we're going to do is we're going to evaluate that with using the Daniels Fund Ethics Initiative principles and using Kellerman's 7 paradigms of bad leadership. And I've got handouts, so I'll hand those out to you. There's not quite enough for everybody, so you'll want to share. But I want y'all to be in pairs, or well, groups of 2 to 3. And then what we'll do is we'll play some clips, and I'll give you some context just to make sure that everyone's on the same page. Then you'll have these, and you'll be able to look at which ones of the 7 paradigms of bad leadership does Thanos' actions fall within. And I would argue it's not necessarily just one. And then which ethical principles is he specifically violating? And honestly, which ones is he not? Because there are some that he is arguably aligning with just within its own ideological perspective. I think that that's a valuable conversation to have, because there was an entire group online who said Thanos did nothing wrong, which there are problems with that because he committed genocide. But there are different ethical frameworks that we can use to approach this that provide interesting debate for our students to really consider why certain choices are unethical and why they're not, and what are the consequences of bad leadership when we see it. So what I'll do first is I'll hand out the 7 paradigms, and if you could take one and just pass it around, there should be 18 copies, so maybe, yeah, so every other person. And then with the Daniels Fund Ethics Principles, we actually have those up here, so we're very convenient. Thank you, Tracy. But if you could do the same thing, every other person, just take one. And on the 7 paradigms of bad leadership, with these paradigms, the first 3 are mostly ineffective leadership. They're not inherently, it can be both ineffective and unethical, but the first 3 often, when they're violated, they fall within the ineffective realm. The last 4 are often, when they're violated, they fall into the unethical realm. So consider that as you're looking at it. Now I'll give you just a second to get those handouts around. Awesome. Okay, so let's give you some context on the snap. So again, a lot of y'all probably know the snap. So with that, the basic gist of what's going on in Infinity War, and please don't crucify me because I know I'm simplifying this a lot, but the Avengers and Guardians of the Galaxy, they're joining forces to prevent Thanos from gathering all 6 Infinity Stones, and it's like time, power, things like that, that he puts into his gauntlet here on the knuckles and then one in the center. And when he gets all 6, if he can get them, he basically has the power to do whatever he wants, right? And so what he wants to do is eliminate half of all life with a snap of his fingers. So half of all life, and I'm gonna play a clip where he explains how he determines who lives and who dies. So his argument is that he's trying to balance the universe after seeing the destructive effects of unsustainable population growth on his own planet. And again, this is his perspective, right? So keep that in mind, because you may inherently disagree. And I think that that's good to be cognizant of. We really are in these examples talking about both the leaders and the followers. So keep that in mind. Let's take 5 minutes for y'all to discuss, and then we'll share out. All right. So let's go ahead and talk about what you discussed, because I'm really curious what you thought. And we may have a lot of agreement, but once we get into the details, that's where we might see a lot of nuance, and that's what I'm really excited for. So maybe let's start with the 7 paradigms of bad leadership. So where did you see Thanos's action, his logic, falling into those paradigms? Son.
So we discussed primarily, we're seeing a lot of 6 and 7. So the insular leadership and then the evil leadership. Primarily under the sort of the common guise we see with villains these days of doing it for the greater good. The ends justify the means, and like a utopia requires blood and sacrifice for it to be a utopia. So
Yes.
when we look at 6 primarily, when, in the first clip, he's talking a lot about, Titan. He's also talking a lot about, again, the fact that the hardest decisions require the strongest wills. It's almost into the perspective of he's going to make this choice regardless of anyone else's opinions. There's no philosophy talk going on, and he is definitely not going to talk to the trillion of people who are going to die because of that one action he can take. It's like a God complex.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, he kind of inherits for this greater good, this vision that we have.
And is that where you're seeing everyone else as the other? Because you could argue that his own people are affected by that snap too.
But does he ever ask them?
No. Right.
That's the thing that's insular leadership. It's good leadership requires collaboration. It
Right.
requires other voices at the table. And I've seen the movie, it's been a while since I really remember it, so the clips really revived some things, but he's not a very collaborative leader.
No. It's not.
So, I think that even if his own people are like, you should do this, or some are like, don't do this, we never once ever see him bring that to the table of, let me bring a council, let me actually go out into the world and see what are the effects of my actions. Instead, he gets this item, he gets this like Deus Ex Machina item that just allows him to play them.
Right.
And so that's why we're seeing 6 and 7 primarily.
I like it. Anyone else want to add? Maybe you had a different perspective. You saw some things different. Go ahead.
Oh, but not different, just adding on rigid leadership, right? I mean, maybe we didn't really see his followers in those clips. I've never seen the movie,
Right.
but there were people telling him this is a bad idea. He was unyielding to those different perspectives.
Right. Stubborn. He had his vision. He's sticking to
Yeah.
his vision. No one can tell him otherwise. Yes. Any other additions? Yeah, Liz.
Yes, and to everything previously said, but also using some of my prior knowledge about the whole thing. And so and especially talking about fellowship. So like Thanos himself is very rigid and callous, and like he's basically creating his own rule of law here. But then when the actions of the people who are his followers are all like the stereotypical bad guys. So their sort of actions reflect on him, even if he is sort of rising himself above any attempt at moral ambiguity here. So like I feel like something we started talking about was like how much are the actions of others who are underneath him sort of a reflection of his own ability to lead.
Right. So
And we kind of talk, we talk a lot with bad leadership about kind of the toxic triangle with like, bad leaders, fellowship, but then also culture and the role that culture and society plays that allows this to happen.
It's a toxic triangle.
Toxic triangle. But I think it's that component, right, of like bad followership also happens because something is causing them, right? Like climate change, or we can't feed our people, right? So therefore it goes, well, here's the solution. You think about even Hitler a lot. Hitler was a humanitarian. That's how he was first before he became, right? Because he came at a time when it was like post-depression, like you can't feed your family. Let's do all these great, like that's how we got into power. And then he manipulated and used that power. But like interesting with this clip of that component, right? And looking at future films and giving away, but like it flips on them too, right? Where they become the bad leaders. Right?
Oh,
Because
you're talking
the bad-
about the Avengers?
Yeah,
Yes.
like, because then society says you are the bad guy, you have too much power. And then they start doing things
Mhm.
that go against rule of law, that do these things with that question of, well, we're good.
Right.
you know, so it's
Yeah.
an interesting piece too.
So let's move into then the discussion of the ethical principles. So what were the specific ethical principles that Thanos arguably aligned with or disregarded or broke? However you want to do
Okay,
that.
so again, not having seen the movie, I'm like fascinated by his character. And like, I did see some integrity and accountability in that he was very committed to the principle of I'm gonna eliminate people at random.
Right.
And even to the point of killing his own daughter,
Mhm.
when he very easily could have not killed his own daughter, like saved the people in his inner circle and his family, but yet he was somehow so committed to this principle that he like followed through.
Like fairness, right?
Yeah,
Like,
it's like-
everything is fair.
Yeah, so he's like not, so that kind of was weird to me. And I was like, oh, maybe that's a way that he can justify to himself the terrible things that he's doing. And that's like the complexity too of these bad leaders. He's like a tiny kernel.
Right. And you could argue he's taking accountability. Like he's very honest and transparent with like, this is what he wants. So yeah, there's an argument to be made. Gavin.
Well, we can talk about though, and for accountability, it seemed for me, I haven't watched movies also. So it seemed for me that his version of accountability was, I'll see a sunrise and then I'll die.
Right, yeah.
I think I'm like, you didn't have to live with half the population being gone. Like what accountability did you really take if you're like, okay with either the death penalty or you're gonna kill yourself? I don't like, it didn't seem like he was really taking accountability.
There's that callousness, right? Of like, I don't care about other people, but like, I'll own the fact that yes, I'm about to commit genocide. And like, I'm square on it. That's okay, right? What else? What other ethical principles? Maybe that he disregarded or that you could argue aligned with?
I
Nicole?
think an alignment and a disregard I found with viability. I connected that with the callous leadership part because the viability definition, callous leadership definition, it's the discounting or disregard of what would be considered subordinates.
Mhm.
And then in viability, it's creating a long-term value for relevant stakeholders. Who
Right.
identifies who becomes the subordinate and who becomes the relevant. And that part for me just totally aligned that in the snap of the finger, he made that decision. And that decision that in leadership, as Sloan was alluding to, can come from depending on what the culture is at the time. That we have to make a decision for the greater good. And whoever suffers, they become the subordinate. And they are not relevant anymore
Right.
because it is not for the greater good
Mhm.
at the time.
Mhm.
So I thought that was pretty.
Yeah, oh yeah, viability is all throughout this, at least in his worldview, right? His ideological perspective, he's creating long-term viability. This is sustainable, huh? Questionable, right. But in his head, he thinks he's doing this. So you can see how this example prompts some interesting ethical considerations. It prompts interesting discussions and trains of thought that you can really work with your students to think through what is bad, what is good, what's ethical, where does that get gray, and how we can use bad leadership to really dig into the nuance of how difficult it can be to make leadership decisions based on your team. They're often not clear cut, and yet we like to pretend they are. So with bad leadership, this is one of those, and again, it's a really good pedagogical tool because everyone is interested in bad examples of leadership, especially if you use pop culture to do it. So with that, what I want to encourage you to do is use more bad leadership in your team development, in your classrooms, especially if you can maybe consider fictional characters, because in the polarized climate we live in, using real life examples can sometimes be challenging to find one that's not going to make somebody upset. So a fictional character, people don't always have the same, affinity and passion for that person. They're more willing to think objectively, and it prompts a lot of really valuable critical thought about ethics, right? And about leadership and how to lead well. At the same time, utilize Kellerman's 7 paradigms and the DFEI ethical principles combined. So you prompt 2 waves of thought that work together to really get students at a deeper level in terms of their thinking, right, on these subjects. And with that, I want to just thank you again and thank the Daniels Ethics Fund Initiative and the fellowship for allowing me to present on this topic. It's been a lot of fun. Do you have questions?